When I was a baby Christian, we used to have a service that for hours and hours, it was like a kind of a free-form prayer meeting, and we would start at 7 o'clock at night, and basically there was no sermon. People could just kind of come in and leave, and it was just an atmosphere that we created with music where people could come into the sanctuary and just pray, and it was very much a free-form thing, but literally sometimes from 7 on till midnight and even later, we would just create an atmosphere in the sanctuary using music. And as we get ready to talk about this free worship progressions, this whole idea is, I think it's really important. When you think back in the Bible and you think of how David ministered to Saul, and he actually used music to calm his tantrums that he had, and obviously even people who aren't Christians, the whole idea of music therapy, people are aware of the fact that this gift of music can be used to calm down the soul. It can be used to focus people's attention, and obviously in worship it can help people focus their attention on God. So as a musician, this is really a category that deserves some focus and some study and some understanding. And it's interesting, one of the differences between worship and Christian music in general, I like to think of, this is actually a Paul Baloche idea, but he refers to worship as being the unconcert. You remember 7-Up used to be called the Uncola? He refers to worship as the unconcert. And, Christian concerts are great. I mean, I love going to Christian concerts, and that's a situation where people are using the gift of music to minister to you. But worship is really a little bit different thing. The point of worship is not for the audience to kind of sit back and enjoy it. Worship is a participation sport, right? The whole idea is to create an atmosphere using the gift of music for people to enter his gates with thanksgiving. The whole concept is for them to enter into the music. If they leave the church service and they say, "Man, the worship band was awesome today," that's not exactly what you want them to say. What you want them to say is, "Wow, God was awesome today. Was there even a band? I didn't really notice because I was so focused on God." You see the difference? You know what I'm saying? So when I talk about creating a worship progression, I'm not talking about something that's going to impress your musical friends. I'm talking about creating an atmosphere. It's kind of like if you were going to write a film score and create a musical atmosphere for somebody who was going to focus his attention purely on God. That's really what this is all about. It's not about drawing attention to the music, but it's about insulating the congregation and insulating the worshiper from the things that would distract him from God. So you do that in a couple of specific ways. Let's stay in the key of C. The first thing that comes to mind is, say you've just finished a worship song in the key of C. One unfortunate thing that a lot of bands do is they'll finish a great song and the song's over and it's just kind of like, okay, well, what did that do? Any sense that the congregation was enjoying God's presence just completely got blown out of the water, right? The simplest thing to do is just to hang on to that last chord. Don't cut it off, don't stop it. Because what you're doing then, it's like walking into a beautiful candlelit room and shining a bunch of white lights on the worshipers. So don't do that. Just hang on to the last chord. Now the fact that you've stopped the rhythm is going to tell them that, okay, we're kind of closing a chapter. But all you need to do is just kind of keep that chord there and keep it moving. That's communicating to them that, okay, well, we're not exactly moving on yet. So one of the simplest first steps is just to keep that chord moving. Now another simple first step is you might just begin to sort of start some kind of undulating rhythm. Now if I'm going to make a chord change, the chord change I'm going to make is something that's very, very in that close family of chords, right? Probably the closest chord is going up to the 4 chord. So I've got like a little bitty undulating rhythm, I've got a little bit of chord movement, which tells them, okay, we're not exactly moving on to something else yet, but we're camping here for a bit. You're communicating that. It's not like people understand it, but subconsciously they do. So it's like, a cough in the audience or a pin dropping isn't going to bust the atmosphere you have going. Now you notice I didn't even change the bass note. I kept the bass note a constant. To me, the idea is don't do anything that's going to disturb. So any changes that you make them subtle. You can do an awful lot just staying on top of that same bass note that doesn't really knock people out of the mode that they're in. Now, this is where you can apply everything we've talked about in all these other chapters. Think all the way back to when we talked about added tones. Well, you notice like I'm adding the second to all these chords. Actually, that first chord change, that's a pedal tone. You know, I'm keeping the pedal tone in the bass. We talked about pedal tones. Even when I'm going to that 4 chord, I'm adding a second to that. Added sixth. So eventually, you do need to create a little bit of motion because you don't want it to get boring for them. So maybe you just keep that same progression and move the bass up to the 4 chord. Now, when we talked about form, we talked about things moving in groups of 4s, the Fantastic Four, you remember that? I would apply the same thing here. It not only communicates order and form to the congregation, but also to the band that's improvising with you. So if you sort of do things in patterns of 4s, it's going to be really obvious where you're going, and have little cadences that point out real obviously to your bandmates where you're going. Now, eventually, you might want to move to a different family of chords, or let's think, you know, extended chords. You can bring in like 9ths and 7ths, sharp 11. You can create an awful lot of music, and yet we're still right there. Like we haven't really broken the atmosphere that ended that song. One of the other things we talked about in the earlier chapters, you can use inversions to kind of increase the harmonic rhythm. First inversion chord. Third in the bass. We talked about harmonic rhythm. So in other words, right there, we're pretty much doing one change per bar. You can increase now you notice we're still staying right with those primary triads. We haven't really varied from that. So, you know, now dynamics. We talked about dynamics in an earlier chapter. You know, obviously you're probably starting from a softer place, but you can build, you can drive that, and maybe you get to a place where the music reaches that climax, and, you know, you hit a solid chord and stop. So you could stop and the guy could come up and speak, or you could borrow from a different family of chords. You know, a whole different family of chords would be using some of those borrowed chords that we talked about. So that automatically takes you into a different, you know, when we get to the minor 5 chord, that sort of has that awesome throne room of God kind of sound. That's the way our brains interpret that. So you can even have chapters in your free worship. But the point is, like we're creating an insulation. We're not letting the cares of this world yank people out of this connection that they've got with God. There was an old song when I first became a Christian called "Let's Forget About Ourselves, Magnify the Lord and Worship Him," which is pretty much what the whole thing is about. You want the congregation to forget about themselves and just magnify the Lord and worship Him. That's the whole point. And being able to create this musical atmosphere, this soundscape, the film score behind the worship is a really important skill. You can use this at the end of worship songs. This could be maybe while the pastor is praying at the end of his sermon. You know, you could come and begin to build this in, especially if you know where the song that's coming after that, you know, you could set up that song in your musical soundscape. You could even do this before the service ever starts. You know, when the people are coming into the church, you could just create this atmosphere right from the get-go. So, you know, even while they're coming in, you know, they might be talking about the football game that happened or something in the news, but you can kind of start to put worship melodies in their head and create this atmosphere before the church service even starts. So I'd really challenge you to spend a little bit of time just thinking of the different ways that you can use this form of improvisation to enhance your worship services.